Okay, now I'm recording again. So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to I want to thank everybody for your heartfelt wishes during our family's difficult week last week. I said last week the the week of Shiva felt like March 2020. You know, like it just kept going. It just wouldn't end. It was really, really long. But you know, to see the all the people from all our different walks of life was very, very comforting. And I also want to welcome, we have Carol Silk from Israel. This is amazing. So if you remember, a few years ago, Carol used to join us here when she lived in West Orange. And now I'm allowed to be envious of this, but she made Aliyah and enjoying life in Israel. And for vacation, she's going from the living room to the dining room. And 'cause that's what it's like in Israel. And I also want to welcome Carol's sister, Minna Greenbaum, is here with us. So really, again, a lot of my worlds are coming together. So this is really good stuff. One of the things that I missed most, that was the most difficult for me during Shiva, which I didn't anticipate, but it really turned out to be, is that when a person's in Shiva, you're not allowed to learn Torah. You can only learn Torah that applies to the laws of mourning or sad parts or things that'll arouse your your acts of tshuva, something like that. So for me not to be able to learn, but more importantly, not to be able to teach, was very, very difficult. And not to mention falling behind on Daf Yomi was really challenging. I was 9 blot behind Daf Yomi. I'm getting closer, I'm getting there, but still a lot of catching up to do. In general, there's a lot of catching up to do. But you know what? I don't run the world, God runs the world. So we'll let you know. God does what God does. What I wanted to, and I had such good stuff on Vayigash and Vayechi. Oh my gosh, I was sick one week, and the next week, we'll make it up, God willing, next year. What I want to do now, and maybe this might even take 2 weeks, I'm not sure, is part of understanding as we go into Sefer Shemos, we begin the book of Exodus, is that we have to understand the persona of the most prominent figure in the most of the Torah, which is Shemos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. The next 4 out of 5, 80% of the Chumash centers around, you could really argue, around one individual, and that, of course, is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who is the central figure of the Jewish people. And we go through sort of his early career here in our parsha, and then already next week we go through his career as an active leader of the Jewish people. So it behooves us to kind of investigate and to explore and to see how Moshe Rabbeinu became Moshe Rabbeinu. So let me put it to you this way. If you had to compare Moshe to any character in the Chumash, let's just leave it to Chumash. Let's not say Navi, just Chumash. To whom would you compare Moshe and why? Not
I would say Yehuda. Yehuda.
Okay, why Yehuda feet?
Well, first of all, there are the human flaws that both Yehuda and Moshe overcame. Well, yeah, Moshe too. And Yehuda is one of the central leaders of the Jewish people. We are Yehudim.
Okay.
I'd say Yehuda's almost as central as Moshe.
And yet, Yehuda's people got to go in, he gets to go into Israel and be a king and everything, and Moshe just kind of like, they leave him behind. I mean, that's one of the greatest, I often talk about underlying questions or nagging questions, and that might perhaps be the most nagging question, is that why could Moshe go into Israel? That's a tough one. It's a very tough one. There's no, I mean, whatever answer you give, and the fact that Chazal give dozens and dozens of those answers just shows you that nobody really has a good one. That's a good lesson in Tanakh, by the way. The more answers you have to a question signifies that nobody really has a clue. So we got to come up with like this, that, and the other. Okay. Any other thoughts? I like that answer though, Yafit.
Avraham.
Who said Avraham? Vivian?
Yes.
Hit me up with it, Vermont. Let's go. Vivian, Vermont. Vivian from Vermont. You're our next caller.
Oh, good. Just because he's a central leader, he defines the Jewish people. They both carried the Jewish people to their next stages.
Okay. I happened to that happened to have been my answer I was looking for, by the way. But as my Rebbe in Yeshiva would say, you're saying good, say better.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else? What other? There's one very specific commonality between Avraham and Moshe, which we don't find among any other leaders in Chumash. I'm gonna say you're gonna like, oh, could have had a V8. They were both, and the only two that were actually chosen by God. So we have to see that. So Avraham was chosen. If you remember back in the day when we did Lech Lecha, we was like, remember we talked about Avraham in the fiery furnace and that whole bit. So why did God choose Avraham? So we had our answers there. So then that asked the question, so if God chose Avraham and God chose Moshe, why did God choose Moshe? So then let me ask you that question. Why did God choose Moshe to be the leader of the Jewish people?
Humility.
Humility. Okay. Where did God see Moshe's humility?
He didn't want the job.
Right.
But that's only after he's chosen.
So Miriam Dessa says that's only after he's chosen that he doesn't want the job. Right. So what led God to choose Moshe? So this is where we have to look at the Pesukim very, very carefully. And as we do an examination of the early text, it actually reveals a tremendous amount. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at it together. Okay. You see it? You see everybody sees my screen? Give me a thumbs up, something. Vivian from Vermont, you got it? Okay, good.
Got it.
Yeah. This is the Sefaria translation, but we're gonna fly through a few different parts. But the first chapter of Exodus merely describes for us the situation that the Jews find themselves in. Joseph is dead. All the brothers are dead. There's a new Pharaoh that arises in Egypt, and he is not nice. And he decides, hey, let's commit some genocide. You know, it's like, let's kill the babies and the male babies and the girl babies and the babies and the babies, no problem. And then you have some people that were defying him. Okay, that's chapter 1. Great, beautiful, set the stage. You know, the stage is turned. So if you're following with me here, or if you're following in the Stone Chumash, it's Perek Beis, it's page 296. It's the second chapter of Exodus, okay? Now, there are a few characters in which we are introduced to their lineage, or we're introduced to them before they are born. Moshe is one of them. And look, in Bereshis, it happens all the time. But the rest of the Chumash, the rest of Tanakh, it does not happen all that much. So can you think of another character, let's say, where we're sort of told about this impending great like the Torah, the text builds up for us, sort of like this is going to be somebody. So before, after Bereshis, post Bereshis. From Shemot and onward, and you can go all the way through Tanakh, okay? So think of the story of Chana. We read in Rosh Hashanah. Chana, and she's davening, and she's in Shiloh, and they think that she's drunk, and you know that whole bit. What about that, right? What about, you know, and of course she gives birth to Shmuel, right? So you know that like God's greatest Freudian, you know, setup that we have. This it's next what today's in 10 days I'm celebrating, please remind me so I don't forget. In 10 days I'm celebrating my 25th wedding anniversary. Okay, don't ask my wife how many years because she may not get the number right. I'm the numbers guy, I get the dates right. But her Hebrew name is Chana Sarah, and my Hebrew name is Yitzchak Shmuel. Chana was Shmuel's mother, Sarah was Yitzchak's mother. So do with that what you want. I'm just saying, you know, I mean, it's anyway. So we have, who else do we know that we like who they were born? Shimshon. So here, and they're like very dramatic, and this child's going to be born, and he's going to be given to God, and he's going to be a Nazarite vow, and they couldn't have children, Manoach, it made it into Haftorah. So here we're introduced to Moshe, but it's like pales in comparison to those. So it tells us, Vayelech ish, here we are in Pasuk Aleph. Vayelech ish mibeis Levi v'kachas bas Levi. A guy from Levi married a girl from Levi. Vatara isha vatelet bein vatera sikitav hu vatetzvanei shlosh yoachim. She conceives. She had a son. She saw how beautiful he was. He was so good. She hid him for 3 months because there's this decree that you have to kill all the babies. She couldn't hide him anymore. And she puts him in the basket. And we know the rest of the story, okay? So before going any further right now, what is noticeably missing in this story?
The names of the parents.
Yeah. Why do we not know his parents' names?
And his name.
And Miriam Dessa, so even better. Oh, we don't even know his name. Who, by the way, who gives Moshe his name? It's the daughter of Paro. It's not until, okay.
Because
Look,
she drew him out of the
floats,
water.
she floats down. She picks up the kid. Her arm stretches out like Inspector Gadget and picks up the kid with the basket. Okay, and then the best thing is the sister negotiates a deal that his own mother should be the wet nurse. Like such a Jewish concept. I love it. That she should get paid to nurse her own child. I love that. And then here it's not until verse 10. Normally it's like they got married, and it's in one verse. She got married. She was with child. Said child is born, and they called him this because he was this. Or she called him this because, my husband doesn't love me anymore, whatever it is. It's not until verse 10, look at this, Vayigdal hayeled, the child grows up. Then they bring her to Baspar. So like he's already weaned. He's like a little toddler already. They bring her to Paro. She is like a mother to Vahilol Vain. She makes him like a son. Vatikra Shemo Moshe. She, meaning the daughter of Paro, calls him Moshe because she says, "For I have drawn him from the water." So a lot of interesting things here is that first of all, Moshe is not a Jewish name. Then don't tell my son that. Okay, some say it comes from the name in Egyptian was Messes, something to do with the son, like Ramses. Messes, it's very much related. Okay, but he is Moshe. He's not. So what did they call him, by the way, until he was named by her? Well, if his own mother was wet nurse for him and she was taking care of him, we know the Gemara tells us he had a lot of other names, right? Kasriel, it's one of the cool names.
Yeah.
What's the other one? He had like 7 names. They say like a whole bunch of names. Avigdor. So often you'll hear the name Moshe Avigdor together. Those two go together because it's like Yitzchak, Isaac. They go together. Okay. All right. So it takes 10 verses, Nebuch, to give this baby a name. No wonder he couldn't talk. He was stammering. There was nobody there to give him a name, right? So if he didn't have a name, how could he talk? So wait a minute. So let's go back to the beginning here then. What is the significance? Why would the Torah deliberately omit the names of his parents? Don't you think that's important? I think it's pretty important, right? So when we study this again, especially when we use the modern approach of Parshanut, is what Rabbi Bernstein would call it Parshanuti. He's that approach. I'm teaching him. I'm bringing him along. He's learning my ways a little bit. I'm learning his ways. When we have a glaring anomaly such as this, it's there to specifically point something out. Don't look at what's missing, but look at what's there. What's missing will focus our attention on what's there. So if I ask you then, what's there? Right? Because I'm so tempted to pick on Miriam Schwartz, but I can't do it. It's not fair. No, she's like, oh, I don't know how to unmute. I can't unmute. Right. So what is there? It's all in the first pasuk. Vayelech ish mi beis Levi vayikaches bas Levi. So if I had to tell you, if all I had was this, and Moshe comes from this union, you're going to tell me that what? Moshe is a purebred what?
Levi.
Purebred Levi. So there already now you start to wiggle your antenna and you're like, okay, this now already is something. This is where we have to be focusing on. He's Levi. So then I start, searching the databases. I start going through my mind and say, what do I know about Levi so far? If anybody could tell me, what can anybody tell me up until now? What do we know about Levi other than he got the second Aliyah in the Torah? He doesn't get the second Aliyah because they were not Levi, wasn't Levi yet. What do we know about Levi thus far?
He had a temper, but he redeemed himself.
He had it. I'll agree with the first part of your statement. The redeemed himself has not yet happened. Because the last thing we saw of Levi was in last week's parsha when Yaakov gives the bracha to his children, and he puts Levi not even alone. He puts Shimon and Levi together, and he said, you guys stink. Okay, I mean, I'll just read out to you what the bracha is. And by the way, if your parents ever give you this kind of bracha, I would run the other way. Simon and Levi are comrades. See, they're communists. Their weaponry is a stolen craft. In their conspiracy, may my soul not enter. With their congregation, do not join. All my honor, for in their rage they murdered people, and at their whim they hamstrung an ox. Accursed is their rage, for it is intense, and their wrath, for it is harsh. I will separate them within Jacob, and I will disperse them in Israel. How's that for a bracha? Good Shabbos. Thanks for coming, right? Like, yeah. Oh, you have anything left for me, Dad? I would hate to be the guy after Shimon and Levi. So what is that episode obviously referring to? It's referring to the episode that we saw in Vayishlach, Michael Zuckerman's Bar Mitzvah Parsha. That what? The story of Dinah. It's a story they don't usually teach you in yeshiva because it's like, it might lead to dancing. And you might find out that, sometimes boys and girls, they do things not appropriately, and that girls shouldn't go, chas v'sholom, and like, that's what happens if you show your elbow, you're going to end up like Dinah. Like, I'm sure, I can only imagine the kind of mussar they would give. But what happened is that Dinah went out. She was found by the whole story of Shechem, and Shimon and Levi, the end of the story was they decimated the entire town. They are murderers. So here you could now, again, only going what we know up until now. Shimon, Levi, so why Levi and not Shimon? So Shimon, we know that, and the Gemara has all these, the way we deduce who's what, but Shimon probably just kind of had this, mad streak within him. But Levi was acting more as, and he's older. I'm sorry, he's not older. He's the third brother, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. But Levi has more of a purpose to him. And this goes into what Yafit alluded to earlier when she talks about redemption, is that if they were so cursed within Israel, look at the trajectory of those two tribes, okay? And if you had to look at, if you had to chart it on some sort of graph, it's like Levi's stock would ultimately go up and Shimon's would go into oblivion. When the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, Shimon does not even have enough in the tribe to assume land. They get subsumed under the territory of Yehuda. Whereas Levi, what happens to Levi? Levi gets Moshe, Aaron, Miriam, Kohanim, Levium. They all come from Levi. So they had some sort of redeeming quality. Particularly, we look at the story of Baal Peor. Baal Peor, when there's this terrible incident going on, a public defilement of character and a display of just this terrible behavior in public, and Levi stands up and does something about it. It's Pinchas, who's part of Levi, and Shimon kind of like, I'll join in. So that's the difference. So therefore, Levi has within him what you would call, what's the one word I'm looking for? Zeal.
Potential.
Zeal. Levi is zealous. Levi is very zealous, and Levi has this quality within him that is going to not hold back and act out towards others when he feels wronged or when he feels that he has to step in. So using that backdrop then, let's look at the early life of Moshe Rabbeinu, okay? And let's look at this. So there are three incidents in the beginning of Moshe's life that the Torah clues us in on before he even gets approached by God. Again, so you have to look at these as a unit so that then maybe we can get an idea of what it is that God was looking for. What is it that God saw in Moshe Rabbeinu before? Obviously, God didn't call him Moshe Rabbeinu. His mother didn't call him Moshe Rabbeinu. When she was nursing him, she didn't say Moshe Rabbeinu. She just called him whatever. But what quality did God see? So he, right now, all the Torah is giving us, this is what I'm saying, this is a literary clue where it's saying, it could just say a man married a woman, Why does it have to say a man from the house of Levi? A daughter of Levi. He's a purebred Levi. He's Levi through and through. That's teaching us, that's a clue. That's something that we have to look at and say, maybe that identifies his character, and maybe he's bringing something of that sort of genetic makeup as he's going forward in his career as a Jewish leader. Okay, so he scrolls through, we go through, he's named, she grows up. Okay, fine. Verse 11. Okay, you with me? Verse 11, it's Pasuk Yud Aleph. If you're in the stone, it's page 298. Okay, it's the third Aliyah. It was in those days, Vayigdal Moshe vayetze alacha vayar b'sivlosam, vayar ish mitzri makei ish ivri me'echa. A very, very difficult pasuk, okay? Could somebody translate this for me in real English? I mean, we could read it here, but it leads to, this is very difficult to translate because if Moshe is growing up in the palace, how does Moshe see himself?
Supposedly is an Egyptian, but obviously he has compassion and empathy for the Ivri. So he knows something is different. Right.
The Mefarshim point out that in the first chapter, by the way, when it refers to the punishments put upon the Jewish people, it always uses the singular. Vayasimu alav sarei misim. So they appointed taskmasters. It's like not even people as in it, as an entity, over it. V'kasher yi'anu oso ken yirbe v'chein yifrutz vayakusu b'bnei b'nei Yisrael. As much as they would afflict it, it would increase, it would spread out. They became disgusted because of the children. Often the singular is used to refer to Bnei Israel, almost like to dehumanize them. They're not people anymore. They're just like it's something. Yet with the Egyptians, it's always referred to as the plural. And if that's the case, some argue that they are, Moshe, if he's Egyptian, and what's the purpose of the Jewish people is to do the work for the Egyptians. So Moshe grows up. I don't know how old is he? He's a teenager. He's 19, he's 20, whatever it is. He's a young guy, which, by the way, then makes us scratch our heads because then when he really comes on the scene, he's 80 years old. There's a whole clunk of his life that's missing, which we're going to talk about that in a second. So he gets up. So some argue that when he went out, he wanted to see, and he wanted to see their vestibular means their burdens. Okay. He went out to his brothers, the Egyptians, and he wanted to see the burden of the Egyptians, meaning like, are they being taken care of? It's a very interesting reading of the pasuk because the pasuk doesn't make a lot of sense. And then he sees a Mitzri hitting another Ivri, and then Me'achav. So it's right now, that's right here, this when the Egyptian is beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, it's not so much that he looked at the Jewish people as his kinsmen, but when he sees Nebuchadnezzar, that this Yid is being beaten, it changes something in him. He starts to feel like, wait a minute, this isn't okay. I get it, we have people that work for us, we have servants, but like yesh kavul, right? At what point do we say that this is like improper behavior? Why is it okay for us to just completely, I understand to have people work for us, but to lord over them in such a way and to beat him perhaps unnecessarily? So what does he do? He goes into action. He turns this way, he turns that way, and there's nobody there. And by the way, the rule of thumb is somebody's always looking. Somebody always sees, especially now because, we live in Big Brother. I saw this thing. If you ever remember really bad series of movies with Mel Gibson, first of all, now probably anything with Mel Gibson is bad because he's such an idiot. But these Mad Max movies. So the original Mad Max movie, which came out, probably in the late 80s, and it was this futuristic, the world is ending, and it was set in 2021. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there for you. So, It's like, when we passed the Back to the Future date, then we knew it's like, okay, we're getting old. But when we hit the Mad Max date, like, and maybe it's not so off, and especially some of the stuff that those guys are wearing would be perfectly acceptable. You could probably even be elected to Congress now. So he looks, somebody's always looking. He looks this way, he looks this way. He kills the Egyptian. Moshe acts in a very zealous manner, and he does something about it physically, and that's it. That's episode number 1. Then right away, Vayetze bayom hasheni, he goes out the next day, and here's our favorite Jewish activity: Jews fighting with one another. V'hinei shnei anashim ivrim nitzim, vayomer l'rasha lo masa kereyecha. He sees somebody who's trying to intervene, about to hit a Jew is about to hit another Jew, and all of a sudden he steps in and he gets involved. Now, they didn't ask for his help. He didn't ask if they were interested in his help. He just stepped forward. Again, another act of zeal. However, this time he uses his words and he doesn't physically get involved. Maybe he doesn't have to, but then they come back with a heck of a retort in verse 14, where they say, Vayomer, mi samcha leish sar v'shofet aleinu, halahargeni ata omer kasher harakta es hamitzri, vayira Moshe vayomar achein noda hadavar. They say, what? You're like judge, jury, and executioner. Ish sar v'shofet aleinu. You think that, you are you could do everything yourself. By the way, and if you read in Judy Klitzner's book, she wrote this great book called Subversive Sequels in the Bible, which don't let the title fool you. It's a fantastic work of modern Tanakh study. But she writes that this is similar to Yisro's complaint against Moshe when he's like, you can't do everything yourself. That's the advice from the father. You think you can run everything and answer every question. No, you need to have a hierarchy. You can't. Everybody wants to know what bracha you make on Pringles. You don't have time for that. You have people that can answer that for you. 6th graders, they learn, right? It's shahakol because it's processed. So they have to know. They had Pringles in the midbar, by the way. If you want to know something interesting, anytime you buy Pringles in America, if you look carefully, it has Hebrew writing. They all come through the Hebrew hashkachas, and they have the Hebrew hashkachas on everything of Pringles in this country. I don't know why it's a thing. Move on. So he goes, and they smack him down, and they say, "You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian?" So he tries to establish justice. The first time he does something about it. The second time, he uses his words to get involved. But what's the end result of this? In verse 15, we're told, "Vayishma Paro es hadavar hazeh vayivakesh laharog es Moshe, vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paro vayeshev be'eretz Midyan vayeshev al be'er." Paro heard about this. He wanted to kill Moshe, probably because he heard about the first incident. Now, this is problematic in and of itself, because if Paro's daughter has raised Moshe in their house, it gives us an insight sort of that family dynamic. Paro doesn't view Moshe as a son, like the movie would have you believe, the 1956 Cecil B. DeMille epic, which is always shown on Easter. Okay, it's not Paro. Like maybe Paro. Who knows? Maybe she had a lot of kids around. I don't know. Does Paro have a relationship with him? Because you would think that if his daughter, Bas Paro, raised Moshe, Paro would know about it. And the fact that he killed some taskmaster, like big deal, like a dime a dozen, right? Well, I'm gonna kill Moshe because of this. So that's something to think about. But Moshe's choice is not to stand by and justify his actions. What's his choice?
He runs away.
He runs away. That's episode number 2. The third episode happens right away, and he gets to Midian, which is probably somewhere in Saudi Arabia. This is before the Abraham Accords. So before there was even a problem, you can go to Saudi Arabia, no problem. And he goes, of course, what do you do when you go somewhere we don't know? First thing you do, you go to the watering hole, you go to the Be'er. We've seen this before. And the Kohen Midyan had 7 daughters, and the first one's name was Zephra. And they go and they're drawing water, and they fill the thing to water the flock. And then here in verse 17, of course, what always happens with the girls, it's like it's so chauvinistically righted. And I'm not such a feminist, but by the way, amen and a woman. I swear that if I didn't know for real, I would think that was a skit on Saturday Night Live. But sadly, that is America. What do you want me to tell you? Okay, there's a beautiful combination of ignorance and liberalism, but okay. So Vayavo haroim vaygarshum. Of course, these nebuchal, these medlach who have to go and they have to feed the sheep and the water the sheep, and they can't do it them. They can barely pick up the things. Oh, and the mean shepherds come by and chase them away. Oh, then what happens? Vayaka Moshe vayoshion vayashkes tzonam. Moshe rises to their defense. He drives them off, and he waters them. Okay. Now it's interesting. At first, it says. It's an interesting wording of the pasuk also, because it says vayavo haroim vayigarshum. The shepherds come, and then he drives them off, and then Moshe gets up and saves them. You would think that he saved them by driving them off. So you have to look at the wording carefully. But how did he drive them off? We don't know. He certainly didn't use physical violence, because it would have told us. He didn't say anything, because it would have told us. So maybe Moshe has this formidable presence where all he had to do was stand up and like fold his arms or something like that, and they ran. They bolted out of there. I don't know, maybe that's what it is. Okay. Then of course what happens? The person always gets to marry one of the daughters. Okay. So he's 3 incidents. First incident, violent reaction. Second incident, a verbal reaction. And the third incident is nothing. We don't know his reaction. No, he's just there, and somehow he chases them off. Okay? So now, this is where we look at the sort of the progress of his life. So we have these 3 incidents. God has not spoken to Moshe yet. We're just laying the groundwork for perhaps why God may have chosen him. By the way, much of this, it's been written out expensively. I'm sharing this through. This is a lot of this is based on ideas of Rabbi Tzvi Grummet, who is a noted educator in I think he teaches in Torah Shrag also, but in many institutions in Israel. But he wrote a book on this. There have been many books written about the leadership of Moses and Moshe. Extensive. Rabbi Moshe Lichtenstein wrote a book. Erica Brown's book on Bamidbar is basically based on the life of Moshe Rabbeinu, and so a lot there, and Aviva Zornberg. So there's a lot that is out there if you're into this sort of thing. But Moshe's 3 incidents, 3 episodes. Now, let's say he's, 18, 19, 20. Okay. Moshe then stays with his wife and his father-in-law, and he is a shepherd. So he's left his old life behind. He even has a son. He has a son, Gershon, who's a stranger in a strange land. We're not sure which is the strange land that he's referring to, but that's a whole other share for another time. Okay. And then we're told that a long time, Vayihi Bayamim, verse 23, Vayihi Bayamim Harabim Hahem, a long time after that, it's Bayamim Harabim Hahem, which is an interesting phrase, which we don't see much. The king of Egypt dies. The Israelites were groaning under their bondage and they cried out. And finally, God is going to hear their cry. The end of the chapter is God saw Bnei Yisrael and God knew. He looked upon the Israelites. That's it. Okay. Now, chapter 3. Moshe is a shepherd for his shver, right? Because that's what you do if you're a good son-in-law. You work for the shver. And he is guiding the tzon. He's guiding the sheep in the desert. And he goes to the mountain of God in Choreb. Now, obviously, he doesn't know that it's the mountain of God. The Torah is telling us that he's in Mount Sinai. He's in Har Chorev. And then, of course, we have the episode of the burning bush. Okay. Now, we know that and we could prove this from the end of the chapter, that when he finally goes back to Egypt, how old is he? He's 80 years old. 80 years old. So he spent, let's just say for argument's sake, he spent 60 years, all midrashim to the contrary notwithstanding, but let's say he spent 60 years in the family business, walking around after the sheep, looking at the sky, counting rocks, counting sheep, living this nice, peaceful life. What might you argue that he's doing? He's certainly not zealous. He's not saving anybody. And it's weird that it's very unusual that you would say like, oh, this guy, look at this great character. He was such an activist. And then he disappeared from the scene. And then he appears, 50, 60 years later, and all of a sudden he's an activist again. But if you read carefully, that's not exactly what happens. Is that when God picks him and he's 80 years old, and this, again, something that Yafid alluded to earlier, is he's not interested. He's not. This may not be why God chose him. Maybe despite that God chose him, God actually gets angry with him. But maybe he's trying, and this is the Rabbi Grumit's theory, is maybe he's trying to run away from that part of his character. It's like his intense therapy. He goes to like meetings every single day. It's like, hi, my name is Moshe. Hi, Moshe. Yes, I have aggression issues. I have issues with my temper. And by the way, they say that about Levium. And I don't hope anybody here is a Levi or related to a Levi. So we joke in our house that, we finally had a son, Moshe, that he didn't have a pidyon aben. So it's like, yeah, because he's a sixth. I'm like, no, because his mother is a Bas Cohen. But there's a certain a fire, a brent that they say in the family of Kohanim. Okay, so God appears to him, and he maybe he doesn't want a life of action. Moshe's perfectly content. He's perfectly happy to be there, and God approaches him at the burning bush. Okay, he doesn't really want to go. It's like a car accident that you can't look away from. You don't want to go, but you can't help yourself. Okay, so it's a very interesting exchange here in the beginning of the chapter. An angel of the Lord appears to him, and there's fire coming out of the bush. He looks. There's a small bush. It's not burning. It's burning. It's not burning. I don't know. It is burning. It isn't burning. He says, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Some say he wanted to go turn away. Somebody wanted to go forward. Hashem saw that he turned aside to look, like, don't look at it. And Hashem called for him and he said, Moshe, Moshe. And he says, I'm here. And he says, take your shoes off. Okay, this comes the age-old Jewish custom of taking your shoes off in the house, unless you had European grandparents or they yelled at you, God forbid, you don't go barefoot in the house because that's what you do in the house of mourning. Okay, so he says, this is holy ground. And now God starts with his spiel. Vayomer Anochi Elokei Avicha Elokei Avraham Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov. He's like, I am the God of your fathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, this may come as a shock to Moshe. We don't know yet how Moshe identifies. Remember, it said a Mitzri, an Egyptian man saved us. He came dressed as an Egyptian. He's raised in an Egyptian house. He didn't exactly go to yeshiva. So you're going to say, oh, well, his mother nursed him and she was learning all Mishnayos with him and she only gave him Chalav Yisrael and he had tzitzis and he wore a gartel. I don't think so. Moshe's a man of the world and, he doesn't really have much Jewish background. And God's saying, oh, by the way, you're Jewish. So like, hello, shock number one. God's talking to you and okay. And so Moshe hides his face because he was afraid to look at God. I mean, by the way, I'd be afraid too. If I was somewhere and then I hear voices and I start answering them, I'd also be like, I have to have my head checked, okay? And God says, look, I saw the suffering of our nation in Egypt in verse 7, and I've listened to their cries, and I know their sufferings, okay? We're getting ready for Pesach now. Pesach, it's almost Pesach. It's already 2021. We have to think about Pesach, okay? And I have to go and I have to save them, and I have to bring them back to the land of flowing with milk and honey. This is the first time that we have this phrase, Zavas Chalav Devash, flowing with milk and honey in verse 8. And I have to bring them to the place of all these nations. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. He says, therefore, okay, so here's charge number one. By the way, count them right here. Count them. If God, so let me ask you this before we go further. You're shepherding, or I don't know what the proper term is, shepherdessing. I don't know what that is. Because again, like you say any pronoun now, it's wrong. Unless you have it like in your tagline in your email. I saw a great thing. There was a guy, he's pulled over in the HOV lane. One guy in his car, and the cop pulls him over, and he says, my pronoun is they. So anyway, it's the only way I can get by is by, anyway. So somebody speaks to you in a desert, and you're pretty sure like this is a real, like this is God. He says, by the way, I'm God. And you belong to me, and you're part of this great nation. I'm going to take care of things. And God says, here's what I want you to do. Who in the world would have the chutzpah to say no? Who would even be able to answer? So let's see what Moshe's response is. So God says, by the way, I'm in the verse 10, I'm going to send you to Paro, and you're going to take my people out of Egypt. So Moshe says, whoa, easy, God, I'm almost, this is going, I'm a shepherd. So, but if you're going to say no, what's the first response you should give? First response is, I got to ask my wife. That should be the first response. Okay. He doesn't even go there. He says, wait a minute. So this is response number one. He says, Moshe says to God in verse 11, Mi anochi kelecha paro. Who am I? So he pulls the old humility approach. Who am I? Like, who, me? Right? It's like Alfred E. Newman, like, who, me? What did I? And God says, verse 12, I will be with you. It's going to be a sign that I sent you. And when you freed the people from Egypt, you'll worship God on this mountain. Okay. Moshe's turn to respond. Okay, God said, who am I to send him? He says, I'm going to give you a sign. You're going to be good. So now, verse 13, Moshe says to God, wait a minute. I'm going to come to the Israelites. I'm going to say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they're going to say, what's his name? What am I supposed to say to them? This is excuse number two. He's saying, and by the way, it's pretty weak. It's like, well, okay, I was sent by whom? Oh my gosh, what do I tell them? Who sent me, right?
Well, maybe because he doesn't does he even know he's Jewish? Like you said before, he doesn't know what to identify as. So why am I going over to these people? In that sense, who am I going to say sent me? I don't have any connection to you.
Right. He's giving very logical answers. Miriam here says that he's giving very logical answers of that naturally they're going to ask, but what is the underlying current of what's going on? He doesn't want to do it. He's not interested in doing it. So God says to him, he's like, oh my God. God says, here's verse 14 of God's response. Again, this is exchange number 2. By the way, some say that this ehiyeh, when you read that in that phrase, it's actually a name of God. You can't say it in vain. You have to say ekeh, asher ekeh, like that. And he says, this is what you're going to say to Bnei Yisrael. Ekeh sholachani elechem. This God named Ehiyeh sent me to you. And God further says to Moshe, this is what you're going to say to the children of Israel, verse 15. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov has sent me. This shall be my name, and this is my appellation for eternity. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, and Jacob, and I have taken note of what is being said and done to you in Egypt, and I have declared, I will take you out of the misery in Egypt. They will listen to you in verse 18, and they will go to the elders of Israel and the king and say to him, let my people go, and let's go to a distance of 3 days, and we're going to worship our God. Yet I know, of course, that the king's not going to let you go. I'm going to have to take you out with a strong hand. So God's going like a whole Megillah. He's giving the whole playbook. This is what's going to happen. He's going to say, no, you're going to do it anyway. We're going to have miracles. And I will get rid of all these Egyptians. And then you're going to go, you're not going to go empty-handed. And everybody's going to have lots of stuff. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Chapter 4, what happens? After here's this whole, God gave him the playbook. He said, this is what's going to happen. He's going to say, no, you're going to go. We're going to have miracles. Trust me, I'm God. I can make a bush burn and not burn. And I could talk to you and I could do stuff. And I know who you are. And, and he gave him, just to make sure, he gave him his social security number. And he told him what his favorite color was. And he did the David Blaine type of stuff on him. Okay, fine. And then Moshe says, this is retort number 3. And he says, Vayan Moshe vayomer v'hein lo ya'aminu li v'lo yishmeu b'koli. He says, they're not going to listen to me. They're not going to believe me. So then God says, okay, what's in your hand? This is, by the way, this is not to be confused with the famous baseball player in the Yankees that was married to J-Lo. And he says, what's that in your hand? And he replied, a rod. For all you Yankee fans out there, okay. He says, throw it on the ground, the snake, and pick it up. And it's not a snake, it is a snake, okay. And then he says, now they're going to believe that this is the Lord, that the Lord of Abraham took you. And then he says, again, put your hand, do the Napoleon thing, and like put your hand in your shirt, you pull it out, And then he says, put it back and what it's like. And if they don't believe you, they're going to believe this. And then again, here it is. Look at verse 10, retort number 4 from Moshe. Moshe says to God, Bi Adonai lo ish tvarim anochi gam itmol gam shoshom gam yaz derechel avadecha ki chpatech vad lashon anochi. He says, he's stammering. So some say literally stammering. Of course, we know the great medrash that when he was a baby and to pick the crown and the malach pushed his hand on the coals and he touched to his mouth and he stuttered. Shkoyach. That's good for the Seder. But he says, I don't know how to talk. Okay. That's retort number 4. And God says, who do you think gave man the ability to speak to begin with? Who makes him dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not me, the Lord? Now go and do what I say. And then finally, in verse 13, Moshe gives retort number 5, and he says, Vayomer bi Adonai shlach no bi'at tishlach. Please make someone else, like send whoever you want. But like, so what's coming out here, by the way? Moshe's got a lot of chops.
It's almost a chutzpah.
A lot of chutzpah.
I mean, it's the first, it's not like he's spoken with him several times before and now this is a conversation he's having. It's the first time that they've spoken. And it's a lot of back and forth with a lot of detail.
A lot of back and forth. So maybe Moshe is, and so why is, so we have to ask ourselves the question, why does God pick him? So maybe God picks him because of his zealous nature. And maybe Moshe is trying so hard to escape his zealous nature that he's willing to go toe-to-toe with God, which, by the way, sets the tone for their entire relationship in his 40-year career with God. Moshe is not, we say he's humble. Humble guy doesn't stand up to God and says, God, take me out of your book, by the way. Take this job and shove it. God, I'm not interested. You want to get rid of them? That's fine. I'm out. He speaks back to God like nobody's business. And here he gives him five retorts. And there's one final retort here, which is very, very subtle, but you have to read it carefully. And this will lead us into, hopefully, next week, because we don't have the time to do everything. So God says, finally gets him. He says, he gets angry, right? Because it says here, the Lord, in verse 14, Hashem became angry with Moshe. And there's your brother Aaron. So I guess, does he know he has a brother Aaron? Does he know who he is? Does he know? The text makes us assume that they knew each other. They were writing letters. They were pen pals. Hey, by the way, Aaron, he's like, I had 4 boys. They're already time for shidduchim, and this Nadav and Avihu, Elazar, Isamar, beautiful names. Yeah, and you're like, I don't. Who knows their relationship? Which, by the way, because of what happens in this parsha, it should not be lost on you that Moshe's children never experienced slavery. They never went into Egypt. They stayed in exile, and they met up with them at Sinai later in Parshas Yisro, which leads to a whole host of other problems. So he says, he gets mad at him, and finally he's like, just go, like that. Aaron's going to be there fine. Look at verse 15. And this is the subtle part that gets lost often. Moshe goes, and he goes to his father-in-law, Yisro, and he says, I'm going to go and return to my brethren that are in Egypt, and I'm going to see if they're still alive. And Yisro says, Geh gesund, lech l'shalom. It's a very unusual pasuk. So, and here's where you have to look sort of at the history. Let's put it this way. Historically, when the father-in-laws were in the picture, in the Bible, in Bereshit, it hasn't been good. Okay? If we look at the model of the father-in-law is that they controlled the children, the daughters, and when his son-in-law came to work for them, they kind of felt like this is mine. So we saw it subtly first with Rivka. If you remember, if you go back in Parshas Chayesara, when Eliezer went and he met Besuel, and he goes to bring home Rivka, when he realizes, he pulls out all the goodies, first of all, he pulls out the jewelry, right? And they look at it and they're like, oh yeah, that's pretty good stuff. Go ahead. This obviously comes from God. So we better go right away. But the next verse, it says very carefully, very clearly, why don't you stay a little longer? Eliezer says, no, we can't. We got to go right now. But it becomes more pronounced, of course, with Lavan and Yaakov. Lavan and Yaakov, no, you got to stay 7 years, another 6 years. Until when? How does Yaakov finally leave Lavan? He sneaks away. He has to run away. What happens when he runs away? He runs away, and Lavan catches up with him because Yaakov has this great troop with him. And what does he say? Habanos benosai, habanim banai. He says, everything is mine. Everything you have is mine. The daughters are mine, the sons, the grandkids are mine, everything is mine. So there's this precedent of the relationship where the father-in-law has ownership over the son-in-law because the daughters are his, okay? There are other places in Tanakh. By the way, we looked at the story Pelegesh Begiva, the story Pelegesh Begiva, where the guy's trying to leave with the daughter, and the father-in-law's like, nah, stay another day, and they end up staying like 5 different nights. Okay, but the biblical father-in-law always wants to hold on to the daughter and to the son-in-law. Okay, but so what does Moshe do? First of all, why does Moshe need to ask permission? Like, he says, I want to go. Like, it's just like this God is like, if God told him to go, and after he refused God 5 times, what is he worried about the shver? So this here, Rabbi Grumman argues, I think it's brilliant, is what? It's excuse number 6.
I was going to say.
This is excuse number 6, where Moshe is looking for a last-ditch effort to not have to go. He's saying if the model holds true, then you know what? Historically speaking, the shver will never let me go. You think the shver is going to let me go to Egypt? Are you crazy? He knows what happened where I came from, right? So this is Moshe Rabbeinu's reluctance. We're going to see. We're going to see, God willing, as we move forward. Again, it's worth spending time looking at the persona, but think about it as you study these parashios. Think about, why did God choose him? If God chose Abraham, we know why, but why did God choose Moshe? Knowing what and all we're equipped with are these 4 chapters in the early part of his life, by the way, which is a lot. It's a tremendous amount. There's really a lot to be said there, because we're not usually privy to this much information about the early life or the early career, even though there's 60 years missing. But there has to be something here about Moshe. So try to think about that, narrow it down, and say to yourself, what is it about Moshe that God sought after? What was he looking for? And why was Moshe so reluctant to take the job? And maybe the answer to both those questions are precisely the reason why he was chosen, and precisely the reason he didn't want to do it is precisely the reason he was chosen. That, like we always say, anybody who volunteers to be the president of the shul, beware of. You never want someone who wants to be the president. The president of shul, if you're going to be president of shul, you have to go kicking and screaming. Like, they have to twist your arm and promise you like every third aliyah, because it is the worst job in the world. It's the worst job in the world. No one is ever right. No one is ever happy, and it's a thankless task. And so who are the guys that want to do it? It's the guy that, he gets no respect at home. He gets no respect at work. Hey, I can come to shul and I could just be somebody and I could tell other people what to do. And then all of a sudden we're going to, stop serving tuna fish at the cholent because that's my decree, at the kiddush because that's my decree. Okay. And it has often been the ruin and destruction of shuls. A bad president can ruin a shul. And I'm not even joking. I'm not being sarcastic. It can ruin a shul because they don't understand about the value of the mission. They don't have the leadership traits. It's all about personal satisfaction. And if that's what you bring to the job, nobody's doing anything. So with that, this is our introduction to Shemos. I hope to look at this a little bit more as we go forward next week. But I think, without looking at the specific text necessarily of each parasha, but you have to understand who Moshe is, because Moshe plays the major role for the next 4 books of the Chumash. So again, I'm so glad to be back in business, as it were. Sorry about this, a few more weeks of this, and then God willing, we'll have maybe we'll have like a little shaving party or something. I don't know. Everybody have a wonderful day, and
Thank you, Rabbi.
everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye.